After you have defined the mapping, the synchronization mapping indicators, now you synchronize the data between the LDAP system and SAP system using the report RS LDAP sync_user. So let's go to the transaction code SA38 or SA38 and execute the program RS LDAP sync_user to begin the process of getting the data from LDAP into SAP system. Now, before you synchronize the data between LDAP and SAP, there are certain things or information parameters that you need to keep in mind. For example, you first have to determine or decide how the data needs to flow between SAP and LDAP. Whether you want the data from SAP to go into the LDAP system, or you want the data from LDAP or the Active Directory system, and you want the data from there into come into SAP. Now you can also have the data go both ways, meaning whatever changes you make in SAP database, that goes and gets updated in the LDAP side, and whatever you do on the LDAP side, that goes and comes and updates in the SAP database. But that is not a normal scenario that customers prefer. Normally the customers would rather have data coming in from LDAP system into SAP, not the other way. Now, apart from the mapping indicators that we did in the transaction LDAP map, when you run the synchronization program, there are certain parameters that you need to use to determine the flow of data. So the options you have three options here basically. One, that objects that exist both in directory and database. So that means you use these options here if you want to update the data on both sides of the environment, that is, you on the SAP side as well as on the LDAP side. So for bidirectional flow of data, you use the options in the objects that exist both in directory and in database radio buttons. Now, if you want to use the IDs or the objects existing on the Active Directory side and you want them to get created or updated on the SAP database, then you use the options in object that only exist in the directory. So this is the scenario, these are the options that you would normally use because you want the data to flow from LDAP system into SAP database. So you use the create in database option when you want to create the user IDs from the LDAP system. Now delete from directory is suppose you want the IDs to be deleted. If you delete the ID in SAP and you want to get it deleted on the Active Directory side, then you can select this option. But that's again you normally won't do. So this is the option create in database is probably the only option that you would use in this box, objects that only exist in directory box for creating user IDs. Now, all of these have certain meaning. The compare timestamp, for example, what does it mean? Now, this is data synchronization. So the only objects whose timestamp was changed are synchronized when you select this option here. Now the synchronization is performed in accordance with the synchronization indicators in transaction code LDAP map. So whatever indicators we chose in LDAP map, only those field values will be synchronized. Now ignore timestamp is for complete synchronization. So that is, all objects are synchronized according to the LDAP map indicators. Whatever indicators you mapped in LDAP, transaction code LDAP map, all those objects are synchronized. There is complete synchronization. Ignore objects. Objects that already exist are not updated on the SAP database or the directory, depending on what flow of direction you choose. But depending on the settings in the other group frames, objects that do not exist may be created. If you use, depending on the other indicators in these other boxes, if the data is not existing in the SAP database side, if you choose create in database, then the data will be created in SAP systems. Now these settings are different in terms of scope of the users to be synchronized. So keep that in mind. Now if you come to the objects that only exist in directory radio buttons, now creating databases, obviously it is like the directory, the Active Directory system is your leading system, that is the source system. And depending on your mapping indicators in LDAP map, the user IDs of the data gets created in the SAP system, in the SAP database. Now, when you select the delete from directory, now again, all these radio buttons work in tandem, they work together. So you just cannot pick something randomly in these boxes and execute the program. So anyway, so when you select delete from directory, now in this case, when you choose this option, the SAP database, the SAP system becomes your source system, the primary system. So if you delete a user ID in the SAP side, by selecting this option, the delete from directory option, you're basically telling that, okay, the ID should also get deleted from the Active Directory side. Now, you don't need, you don't want to do that normally. Okay, so this option you choose for IDs or the objects that do not exist in the SAP, if you want to delete them from Active Directory, you can choose this option. But people don't do that anyway. Now ignore objects. Now if the users are not used in the SAP system, so you ignore them. Ignore in the SAP in the directory side, in the Active Directory side. Now let's go and check the options in objects that only exist in the database. Now when you say create directory, what it means is that if that user ID exists on the SAP side, but it does not exist on the LDAP side, the Active Directory side, then by choosing this option, you're telling the system to create that SAP user ID in the Active Directory system. So whatever IDs that exist in SAP and do not exist in LDAP, all those IDs get created on the LDAP side. Again, this is not a normal practice. Customers don't normally like something to go from SAP into LDAP. So keep that point again in mind. The data has to come from LDAP system into SAP system. Now, delete from database. Now here, the Active Directory system becomes your source system. Now, so IDs that do not exist on the SAP on the Active Directory side. For example, when the user has left a company or employee has left a company, normally after some time the person's user ID gets deleted from the LDAP side. So when you select delete from database, what it does is, if the user ID gets deleted on the Active Directory side, by selecting this option, you can have this program delete the information record from the SAP database also. Log in database. Now here again, your LDAP system is your the source system, the leading system. That is your Active Directory system is your leading system. And what this means is that IDs, the entries or the data does not exist in the Active Directory side. It is to be logged on the SAP data on the SAP side. And normally, the customers normally have this practice of when the users leave the company, the SAP user IDs are not immediately deleted. They are usually logged for a 60-day period or a 90-day period or 180-day period before they get deleted. So even if the user ID gets deleted on the Active Directory side, you can choose by selecting this option to log the user ID on the SAP side. So you have both the choices. You can either delete the record in SAP or you can log the record in SAP, the user record in SAP. Now, again, whenever I'm using the word data, I'm basically meaning that the entries that exist on the LDAP side and the SAP side. So because we are talking about user IDs, what it means is it is user information, your user data that exists on SAP side or the LDAP side. Now ignore objects again is if service users exist in SAP system and are not used in the directory system. So based on how you want the data to flow or how you want to handle the user information, depending on what is happening on the LDAP side or the SAP side, you choose these radio buttons to work with the user data. Now let us go and create and run the synchronization program and see how the user ID gets created. So you select the LDAP server name, the connector that we created now, and let's enter a user ID that we want to create. For example, we want to create this user A041973. Now, if you're running this program is a background job, so that the IDs that created on the LDAP side, they are automatically created on the SAP side. Then you can use this filter. So, but in our demo, we are not going to do that. We are just going to create one user ID to prove that this setup is working properly. So let us go and select the radio buttons. Now, because we want to create the user ID in the database, select the radio button, create in database. And from the objects that only exist in directory. Now let's do the compare timestamp icon in the objects that exist both in directory and in the database. Then from objects that only exist in directory, we select the option create in database because we want to get the user data from the LDAP system into SAP system. And objects that only exist in database, from that box, we select ignore objects. Once this is done, let us go and create or execute the program now. So if the connections are fine, the connection between the SAP systems and the LDAP system is fine, then the user IDs that exist on the LDAP side but not on SAP side, they get created. For example, in our case, we wanted to create a user ID called AA041973, and because it didn't exist on the SAP side, it has got created now. Now, depending on how many user IDs you get created, you will get the list of user IDs here, and each of them should be in the green color. So if you have any yellow color or a red color, you would need to figure out why that is so. So let us go and check whether SAP populate in SAP, the user ID got populated with what the information that we had mapped for synchronization. We need to see the information that got mapped for synchronization. Let's go and say display, please. So the last name, first name, the function got populated, the email got populated. What that didn't get populated here is the department, because we had mapped department also. So we'll see why. Logon data, the accounting number didn't get populated and the cost center didn't get populated. Anyways, now if you look here, the password is deactivated. The only problem with this entire mechanism of synchronization is that LDAP doesn't have an attribute, or SAP does not provide an attribute for password in the schema. So once the ID is created in the SAP system, you need to set the password for the user before you inform the user about the user ID. So you have to keep this in mind. The password doesn't come in from LDAP into SAP because there is no attribute for passwords on that in the schema for getting the password into SAP. Okay, even if you look carefully at the schema extension, the RS-LDAP schema file, you will not find an attribute for password there. So anyway, so let's go and check why this department field was not populated. So let's go and check. Go to LDAP map. Let's go to change. But before we do that, let us delete the user ID. And we recreate that user ID again after we fix the problem. So there were certain pieces of information that did get populated, but there are a couple of them that didn't get, that didn't. So click on mapping, and the department didn't get populated. And why is that so? Let's see. So to find that out, let's go and see why is that so. What is that field for attribute for LDAP, for department? So let's go and find let's do this, okay, and search for that user ID. Actually, this is the user ID, right? Now, these are the LDAP attributes. And one of the attributes that didn't get populated was that we wanted, and was the department. So let's go and check what is the attribute for department, whether it is OU or something else. Right. So let's go and do it carefully. This is the given name. There's the first name. Department. So the department attribute on the LDAP side is department, not OU. So let's go and see what was the cost center. So we don't, or what was that the one? The account name, right? The account was also not populated. Why is that? Because there are no. See, if the values are not maintained on the LDAP side, it will not get populated on the SAP side. So whatever attributes you map, the values have to exist for those attributes on the LDAP side before for you to have it on the SAP side. So the department, there is no attribute here for account. Account number. Okay, so what we'll do, we will, because we don't find an attribute for account here, let us go, it should be the employee ID, right? Okay, let's populate it with employee ID, the account field, okay? So let's go to, so we are going to make changes in the mapping attributes. One for account we'll enter employee ID, and for department we'll enter department, okay? So let's go and do that. After we do that, we'll go and we'll come back and create the user ID again. So let's go to transaction LDAP. No, sorry, LDAP map. Change directory. Oh, so I'm locked. So we're here. Okay, so let's go back. Okay, let's go to mapping. And department, we want to change it to the directory attribute. So department. And the other one that we wanted to change was the account. Cost center. What is that? Log and data tab, right? So date format, decimal format, export. The employee ID, employee number. So let's go to change this to employee ID. So once this is done, save the mapping. Now again, let's make sure that those attributes are mapped for importing, the ones that we changed. So the department is, and then we had the employee ID. So employee ID was not mapped, that's why it didn't come. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, because that was not mapped. Let's see. So let's go and execute the program now. So let's go to SE38, enter the program and execute. LDAP server, then give the connector, the user ID, compare timestamp, creating database, and ignore objects. Ignore objects. Execute. So successfully created in database. Let's go to SE01 and verify the attributes and values again. So go to display. Now you see the department is populated and the accounting number is populated with the employee ID. So depending on, so you could use the existing attributes, the LDAP attributes itself to populate the fields in the SAP side if you think the values are appropriate. So you do not necessarily need to have the SAP attributes extended, every SAP attribute extended on the LDAP side. You could use the existing LDAP or Active Directory attributes to populate the data. So this is again, this is how you create the user IDs by synchronization procedure. The only thing that you need to keep in mind is that again, the password does not get populated, the password does not come into SAP. Whatever password you have on the LDAP side, that password doesn't come into SAP because there is no attribute related to password that SAP provides. Yeah, if you want to do that, you can, if you also, meaning if you also want to have the passwords, then you can use the SNC name field to implement single sign-on, and that way, when you do the single sign-on, the password, LDAP password will be taken into consideration when the user tries to log in. So you don't need to provide a SAP password to the user. So this is how you create or use LDAP SAP integration for user provisioning.